We'll go southeast. It is now 1:43 p.m. Northwest Tower, top level. Princess Charlotte follows you. Score. Thus far, you have eliminated none of your rivals. This gives you the rank of Palace Minister. Still. Down. Northwest Tower, middle level. Princess Charlotte wanders after you. Southeast. Northwest Tower, antechamber. Princess Charlotte trails after you. East. Throne room. The throne room is the exception to the rule that the upper level of the palace be less intimidating than the lower, but then the throne room has no other purpose than to project magnificence. The extent to which it succeeds is a matter of opinion. The gilt throne with its red velvet canopy is certainly impressive, though the bright green telephone right next to it detracts from the effect somewhat. On the other hand, it detracts nowhere near so much as the portraits, and eventually photographs, of past kings on the southern wall. The royal quarters lie to the north, while tower access is available to the east and west. A guard stands watch over the entrance to the royal quarters, whistling to himself. Princess Charlotte follows you. She picks up the phone. "Hi, Jenny," she says. "Guess what? Susie says that Bobby told her that Timmy likes you. As in likes you. Couldn't you just die?" She stares at the receiver for a moment and places it back in the cradle. "She hung up," she says, puzzled. Examine the ground. Now this is more like it. The floor of the throne room, like that of the grand foyer, features a chessboard pattern, but the contrast between the alternating squares in this room is harmonious and subtle, and the squares themselves are far larger. A triumph! Examine the ceiling. Though the Baroque lattice work of the ceiling has much to recommend it, it does put the viewer more in the mind of a medieval monastery or of one of the dank castles that dot the northern lands than of a Mediterranean palace. Once you have the Regency well in hand, perhaps you'll have skylights installed. Examine the throne. Fairly early on in your tenure as palace minister, you had the throne secretly appraised, suspecting that its hue was the result of a few coats of spray paint. You were surprised to learn that it truly was coated in actual gold, albeit of the 14-karat variety. Examine the canopy. As the throne itself is, in essence, little more than a gaudy chair in an empty room, this canopy of red velvet with gold braiding is a rather transparent attempt to inflate the majesty quotient a bit. Examine the phone. This bright green eyesore resting upon its marble plinth is no ordinary videophone, but rather a hotline to heads of state around the globe. All it takes to place a call to anyone from the Emperor of China to Chairman T'Chaka of the Ngungu People's Democratic Republic is to pick up the receiver and then enter a 4-digit access code, followed by the 4-digit code of the country you wish to call. Examine the receiver. Careful examination reveals that it is indeed a telephone receiver. Examine the plinth. The plinth is a simple marble block upon which the telephone is perched. It would be rather unseemly for the telephone to lie on the floor, no? Examine the portraits. They're all here, from Charles the Compromiser, who accepted this little patch of soil rather than press his claim to the whole of the Frankish Empire and risk a war, to Charles the Pedophile, who not only insisted that the Constitution of Piedmont provided for the droit de seigneur, a dubious claim considering that Piedmont has never had a constitution, but used it to procure for himself girls as young as 4 and 5 on the grounds that they were statistically likely to be married at some point, to Charles the Lion-Hearted, named for the cardiac condition that killed him. When he died, his heart was 5 times its proper size, to Charles the Blurry, the records of whose reign were lost in a fire, and of whom nothing is known save for his appearance in this primitive daguerreotype. The last portrait is that of Charles the present king, or, rather, the most recent king. What his epithet will be is a matter for the historians, though you're partial to Charles, the one before the glorious reign of Primo Varicella. so perhaps they might have to abbreviate a bit. Illustrious history, innit? Remarks the guard. Examine that guard. Like the other guards in the palace, guard number 1991 is dressed in a sharp black uniform with fabulous gold-fringed epaulets. Examine the window. No window. All right, let's go east. Northeast Tower antechamber. The northeast tower lies startlingly to the northeast, while other exits lie west of the throne room and south to the eastern hall. Princess Charlotte trails after you. Go south. Eastern hall. Though you've done your best to keep these corridors tasteful, taste is not in the vocabulary of Coffers Minister Argento Rico, whose doorway lies to the east. Across from it is an arch leading to a balcony overlooking the palace courtyard. The arch has been adorned in gaudy gold leaf as a tribute to the immense wealth and even more immense gaucherie of this hall's chief occupant. Tower antechambers, thankfully out of view of this eyesore, lie to the north and south. A portly guard stands watch over the entrance to Rico's quarters, gnawing on a rump roast. You can also see a cooler, which is closed, here. Princess Charlotte trails after you. Examine the ground. The carpet is burgundy with understated beige cross-hatching running through it. Perhaps not what you might have selected, but at least it's tasteful. Examine the ceiling. 3 massive chandeliers hang from the ceiling. The same chandeliers, I believe. Yes. Examine the arch. This is a superlatively tacky arch-shaped portal out to the balcony. Examine the window. These windows overlook the palace courtyard. Examine the guard. Like the other guards in the palace, guard number 3076 is dressed in a sharp black uniform with fabulous gold-fringed epaulets. Unfortunately, the entire front of the uniform is stained with enormous splotches of grease. How unseemly. Examine that grease. You can't help but shudder as you look at guard number 3076's uniform, stained with grease as it is. The napkin is scarcely a recent invention, for heaven's sake. Examine the rump roast. It looks, well, a Varicella would not lower himself to using the term rumpalicious, so suffice it to say that it looks tastier than your run-of-the-mill rump roast. Examine the cooler. This is a sizable hard foam cooler. Bribe the guard. Excellent, the guard says, pocketing the bill. Then our business is concluded. You may pass. Go east. Coffers Minister's quarters. This eyesore is not so much a room as it is a walk-in trophy case. Scattered about you everywhere you look is the detritus accumulated by one for whom acquisition is its own reward, even if that being acquired is less than worthless. An overrated playwright from that dank little island floating in the North Sea wrote that he who steals my purse steals trash. That news would make Argento Rico want the purse in question all the more. A window overlooks the eastern gardens, and the exit lies to the west. Argento Rico, the Coffers Minister, takes off his headphones as you come in. Something I can help you with? He asks. You can also see a plastic dinosaur, a toy robot, a perpetual motion toy, a Newton's cradle, a malachite obelisk, an old coin, a pinboard, a magnetic sculpture, a miniature rock garden, a miniature foam basketball, and a miniature basketball hoop, and a miniature pool table here. Princess Charlotte trails after you. The princess looks at Rico and shudders. Bad man, she says. Very bad. Let's leave. Want to leave. Examine the ground. Not even the Coffers Minister could afford a solid gold floor, so he settled for a tile floor with 10-carat gold for every 10th tile. The effect is reminiscent of an extremely cost-inefficient supermarket. Examine the ceiling. You refuse to grant Rico a permit to have the ceiling torn out and replaced with a loft-style ceiling. So he hired an art crew to create the same effect using some artificial perspective. They failed. Examine his headphones. Rico scarcely goes a moment without some sort of music blaring in his ears. Without it, he'd be left alone with his thoughts, and the silence would drive him mad. Examine the dinosaur. Looks like a stegosaurus. Examine the robot. It's more than meets the eye. Examine the perpetual motion toy. It's a little metal dolphin on a stick, and when you push it, it goes around and around and around. Examine the Newton's cradle. This is a set of 5 silver balls, each suspended by a pair of wires, which act as a sort of collected pendulum. Examine the malachite obelisk. This is a tower about 6 inches tall, made of swirled green stone. Examine the old coin. This is a 1 franc piece from back when coins were made of valuable zinc rather than cheap plastic. Melted down and sold for scrap, this coin might well be worth as much as 5 francs. Of course, 5 francs is a touch less than the amount it would take to buy a piece of candy. Examine the pinboard. This is a board full of sliding pins, which can record impressions of things. Right now they bear the impression of the Coffers minister's face. Examine the magnetic sculpture. This is a sculpture made of a bunch of tiny metal rhombuses. Right now it looks like a cactus. Examine the miniature rock garden. This is a square box about the size of your hand, filled with sand and a trio of largish pebbles. Examine the pebbles. No. Examine the miniature foam basketball. It's about the size and color of an orange, but weighs less than a grape. Examine the basketball hoop. Ah, a miniature basketball hoop mounted on the wastebasket. How droll. Examine the miniature pool table. This is a miniature pool table with balls the size of marbles and cue sticks the size of pencils. Examine miniature pool balls. The marble-sized balls are numbered from 1 to 15. Examine the cue sticks. The pencil-sized cue sticks are freshly chalked up. All right. Examine Rico. Rico's family has been among the Piedmont nobility since the time of Charles Il Fabreau. Only the Polisky clan can say the same. Ricos have featured in the courts of Piedmont more or less continuously since the founding of the kingdom. A Rico was the colony minister who established a beachhead in Argentina for Piedmont, and another one was the ambassador who established the alliance with Song China, just as the Yuan and Ming established themselves as the true powers in the region. A brilliant bit of geopolitics, that. The latest Rico to emerge onto the scene is little more than a child, a greasy adolescent with a boundless fortune, but not a whit of taste or refinement. His father might have been a reasonable choice for Coffers minister, but after that unfortunate yachting accident, Argento was left as the head of the household, and since tradition calls for the richest man in the kingdom to be appointed to the post, the late king found himself railroaded into a thoroughly embarrassing choice. When the young minister parades through the palace corridors in his waist-length open jerkin with clashing hose and pathologically overcompensating codpiece, you're not the only one unable to suppress a wince. Examine the window. These windows overlook the eastern gardens. Examine east. Unlike the immaculate western gardens, the eastern gardens are ludicrously overgrown. It looks like one of the 3 palace gardeners has a pink slip in his immediate future. A page rushes in. "Minister," he cries. "I just heard. Oh." He looks at you. "I, have some news." "Sounds pretty important," Rico agrees. He looks at you. "If you'll excuse us." Eastern Hall. A porchly guard stands watch over the entrance to Rico's quarters, gnawing on a rump roast. "Oh, I wanted to hear the news," Princess Charlotte sulks. "Even just the comics would have been okay. That Garfield just loves his lasagna, let me tell you." Ask Charlotte about Prince Charles. "What can you tell me about Prince Charles?" you ask. "He comes to visit me sometimes," Princess Charlotte says. "Sometimes he throws things at me, and sometimes he calls me names, and sometimes he talks about how his teacher does things to him in the day, like Louis and Rico do to me at night. And sometimes he brings his car and hits me with it, and sometimes he just looks at me and then leaves." Ask her about Louis and Rico. "What was that you said about Louis and Rico?" you ask. "Well, at the beginning Rico would pay the night watchman, and then the night watchman would let Louis in, and Louis would do things that only Tertio was supposed to be allowed to do, and some other things that not even Tertio was supposed to be allowed to do besides," Princess Charlotte says. "Then Rico got tired of paying for someone else to have fun, just in the hopes of making a friend in the royal family, so he decided to come in himself and make friends with another member of it. I tried screaming the first few times, but since I scream a lot anyway, people just ignored me. My, what noisy cats are we?" A page emerges from Rico's quarters and dashes south. Rico himself heads north a moment later. Go east. Coffers Minister's quarters. Princess Charlotte follows in your wake. She picks up the toy dinosaur. "Arf, arf," she says, giggling. "We had a puppy just like this back home." She puts the dinosaur down. "Good puppy. Stay." Gets the dinosaur, the robot, and all the small items, which are the obelisk, coin, and basketball. All taken. Princess Charlotte looks at the magnetic sculpture and rearranges it into a depiction of a screaming angel impaled on a pitchfork. "I call this one Picnic in the Park," she says. Examine the magnetic sculpture. This is a sculpture made of a bunch of tiny metal rhombuses. Right now it looks like a screaming angel impaled with a pitchfork. Princess Charlotte glances around erratically, eyes flashing. Go west. Eastern Hall. Princess Charlotte wanders after you. Go north. Northeast Tower antechamber. Princess Charlotte follows in your wake. Go west. Throne room. Princess Charlotte trails after you. She examines the portraits on the wall. "Hey, that one winked at me," she says, pointing. Go north. Royal quarters. The royal quarters are normally the epitome of sumptuous luxury. Not that you spend a lot of time here, but even though you rarely have the occasion to visit, at least not in person, you can't help but wince at the ravages the late king's team of physicians have inflicted upon this room. All the fabulous vases and objects d'art have been removed to make room for their equipment, which has itself mostly been removed in turn, though there is still a medical rigging next to the now empty royal bed. Windows overlook the northern gardens. "You!" Queen Sarah yelps as you enter, face streaked with tears. What do you want? This is a private area. Is something wrong? You're responsible, you know, if something happens." Princess Charlotte wanders after you. She walks up to the Queen and puts her arms around her. "Hey, sis, don't cry," she says. "Are you crying because your love was killed? Don't worry. It hurts now, but one day you'll be well adjusted again, just like me.